Welcome back to the Board of County Commissioners for the afternoon of Tuesday, February 4th. We are not in Harris Hall. There's a correction. We are now up in the small conference room of the Board of Commissioners. So if anybody's down below listening, come on up. We'll start out with item 13 on our agenda under County Administration. Item A is a presentation, a preliminary outline of our Housing Action Plan. With us is Karen Knudsen from Better Housing Together. Welcome.
Thank you.
Feel free to
Dive
proceed.
right in.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here today and for this opportunity to talk with you all about the work that Better Housing Together has been doing. This is, I think, our checkpoint in this process of working on developing a housing action plan for Lane County, and Better Housing Together's contributions to many efforts that the county has underway. And we'll share with you some of the conversations that we've been having, some of the ideas that have come up, a little bit of framing of how this work will complete by the late spring, which is the timeline that we are working with. And then really want to just have a conversation with you all, hear your thoughts on information that we share, hear questions that you have, and then just keep moving forward. So just as a reminder, the reason for this work and motivation for this work is answering a priority within the Lane County Strategic Plan, and answering this question of how we can increase housing options to reduce the incidence of homelessness and increase affordability. We spoke briefly in the end of September when I last saw you all about 5 primary components of this plan: research and analysis of local needs, as well as partner and community engagement, strategies to meet different needs and recommendations, and then a housing affordability framework. Those 3 bolded bullets in the center will really be the meat of what I share with you today in terms of where we are in this process. Also, just for orientation, specific requests from the county as we tackle this work were also to look at 5 other kinds of buckets or ways of organizing this information. One request, which we very much appreciated, which was to really sort of go into this eyes open and minds open, think about sort of all the ideas that may help us to address that strategic priority impacting homelessness and affordability of housing, and that those ideas may be in or outside of our control, but to gather that information and those ideas if they're within the community. To think and look at and talk about land use restrictions, other factors that are affecting affordable housing, specific strategies for unincorporated areas, obviously population center in our metropolitan surface area here in Eugene, Springfield, but Lane County having much broader set of concerns, and unincorporated areas, rural communities having their own housing challenges to deal with, which are quite unique, as you all well know. And then finally, thoughts about revenue generation and capacity building. So that may be a little bit small for you all to read, but just as a brief overview of this timeline to understand where we've been and where we're headed from really our end of September introduction of this process with you all, background research and engagement, developing priorities and concepts, having some workshops with our network of partners to discuss those, moving through additional kind of milling and development of those ideas and research, and then towards, I think from today and forward, narrowing down to sets of recommendations and developing that housing affordability framework that I mentioned. We conceptualize that as an infographic that could really help to tell the story of why some of these strategies and recommendations are important, and we think is a really key part of communicating the value of this plan and this work to the broader public. Those other circles are just checkpoints with groups of county staff. Following today, a couple of different work group touch points, other focused workshops and technical work groups, and another large partner network workshop to talk about emerging ideas with this proposal, and then towards an April-May finish line for this work. So I wanted to share just briefly as context, as it helps to explain how we are thinking about this work. Better Housing Together very much appreciates the TAC report and the clarity that that has brought to our strategies for thinking about a response to homelessness in this community, and to thinking about how we might achieve that functional zero experience with homelessness for people within our community. In talking with the Housing Policy Board just the other day, one of the points that I wanted to make with that group and for others in looking at the slide is that when we think about the challenge of homelessness and our system's response, we also have an assumption that at the end of the service system there are places for people to go. There's housing for people to move into, permanent supportive housing, affordable housing, market rate housing, a whole diversity of options. And that is a big part of why Better Housing Together is doing our work. Another graphic that I just wanted to share, because I think it's an important part of connecting the dots. This is from a presentation that Homes for Good made to this board just a meeting or two ago, that to my mind really speaks to the value of setting measurable goals and tracking to them, and setting big goals and tracking to them, and understanding that when you're dealing with a crisis that is structural, broad, complex, such as the housing crisis across the number of communities that Layton County serves, you really need to have that kind of rigor and focus in this work, and to look for ways to seize every opportunity that is presented to make progress. So I wanted to both share that as a reference point from a recent meeting, but also just reiterate how much we appreciate that approach. As a third graphic, that helps to also understand how we're talking about transitions from experiences of homelessness, delivery and development of affordable housing, of permanent supportive housing, but also seeing the broader picture of housing development and capacity within this community. I share this diagram, which was developed by Eco Northwest, a detailed model of housing cost and price, because it's important to understand all of the different inputs to this system, and also to understand that there are things that an entity such as Layton County can affect within this system, and also things that are more indirect, certainly, in terms of control. So not everything within this realm is something that maybe this body might be able to significantly influence, but there is a significant opportunity for leadership in understanding that our county, how we think about housing, how we coordinate action around housing. The counties work independently, the counties work with other jurisdictions. That is a place where we see real opportunity for improved collaboration, and also just, I guess, a sense of optimism, and also a willingness to set some of those big goals. To highlight a few points that the county can impact in this model, industry structure is one. So of course, the number of builders that you have in a community, the size of those operations, how large those shops are, what their capacity is, that's going to influence your industry structure, which is going to influence your construction costs. Other factors influencing construction costs include labor, materials, and financing. That could potentially be another area that the county could have influence. Certainly other policy efforts and the kind of et al. List of things are places where the county could do some work. Supply of buildable land is a place for county engagement. Demand for land or housing need is a place for county engagement. And then finally, cost of land, very specifically, because there's control and opportunities and capacity that the county has that really no one else does. So thinking about all of the different ways that you can touch this process. So diving right in, there are a handful of kind of big buckets that these thoughts fall under, and I'll describe the bullet points beneath them. But the first of those buckets is an idea of leveraging land for housing. So when you think about the cost of housing, the process of development, land can be up to 30% of that cost or more in some cases. And so the ownership of land that can be used for housing and that can be leveraged for housing outcomes is significant in the process of development and in achieving affordability. We would encourage the county to, in some cases, begin, in other cases, complete necessary planning studies that would help you to understand your existing capacity and what kind of a lever this could be as you're thinking about county response to the housing crisis. We would encourage the county to explore public-private partnership options and to prioritize housing supply on large urban sites. We're seeing just a couple of blocks away from here what can happen when there's creative partnership between the county and different entities that want to accomplish a higher density redevelopment within our urban areas. And we think that that is something that, when possible, the county should be engaged with more often. Connecting back to a conversation from the other week and what we took to be very encouraging feedback from the discussion this board had around the Lane County Fairgrounds site and the Homes for Good project is in that conversation a number of points raised about other possible sites, places where affordable housing would be appropriate and would be advisable to pursue. And absolutely, we would encourage you to pursue those outcomes and to develop with those partners and jurisdictions proposals and plans for how that land could be part of that solution. So expanding our land bank inventory to 8 or 10 sites of land available, as others could say with more detail than I will. State funding and focus around the same issues that the county is tracking to is, I think, encouraging. It's good news when funding is flowing quickly to this crisis, and it's our challenge as communities to be ready with good projects and to be prepared when those opportunities present themselves. So we would absolutely encourage the county to lead that interagency siting coordination process and make sure that when $5 million, $10 million, $15 million is available, that this county can make a really solid argument for that support and bring more capacity to the community for housing. Lastly, this is just an area that we would like to see studied or better understand. And we see an opportunity at the county given the current sort of foreclosure process that exists. What this says is to develop a first right of refusal program. And essentially, in foreclosure process, typically these are tax delinquent, often vacant properties. It's our understanding that the county doesn't have a current process by which to essentially step to the front of the line for some of those properties. But there is a unique position that the county has, and other jurisdictions have leveraged this capacity to essentially clear titles and create capacity on sites that the private market or private investors would never approach. So broadly speaking, this would be an effort to kind of study this possibility with your property management team and understand if there's a way to fold that into a broader plan for land banking.
Karen, if I can interrupt for a second. I pulled an item off the agenda last week specifically to ask about that process to make sure that things were looked at in our land. Jeff, who deals with our foreclosed properties, basically said yes, they do talk to housing agencies about whether they're interested in land before they go through the rest of the process to put it out for sale. So it's at least my understanding is there already is something in Lane Manual that allows for that. At least that's what Jeff walked us through last week. That's why I didn't pull the item, which we're going to have to fix this week, because I was going to, sort of the same kind of questioning, but whether that needs to be strengthened or not. But I just want to assure you there's already something in place, apparently, where we look at property that is in foreclosure for development for affordable housing.
Commissioner Sorensen.
Did you want to finish?
Grab a couple questions.
Did you want to finish that?
Well, I could respond briefly, I guess. We would love to have a conversation to better understand that. And I think bigger picture, what we would like to see is that with those lands, that perhaps there's not a prioritization of immediate tax-based return from those properties, but actually seeing them as longer term and higher and better use investments for affordable housing. As the landscape changes with House Bill 2001 and what is possible within, I'll say, our city jurisdictions, it changes also some of the potential for different types of projects to blend in pretty seamlessly with their context.
Back on the detail model slide, I wanted to ask a question about, um, about that. Up in the, kind of the center top, you have the word labor as being a factor in the cost. And I'm wondering, what is the reason you did not have profit as being one of the factors? In other words, as the costs go up and as construction costs go up and maybe labor goes up, everything goes up, then one thing that business can do to make more money on any given project is to charge more money and get more profit. And I'm wondering why profit isn't a factor, at least a factor, in the cost of housing. Why only labor would be a cost, but profit would not be a cost.
So I can't answer as to why Eco Northwest would not have included that here, but I think probably the simple answer is that is a variable that probably gets more attention in our conversation about housing than other issues that we could more easily control. One of the biggest challenges that we have in conversations about housing is understanding that the complexity of the crisis we face is not driven out of people who are developing housing just making enormous profits from particular types of projects. It's much more complex than that in terms of why we're not getting the housing that we need and that is affordable.
I need to add something about profit. Profit isn't the margin beyond the cost of goods. The margin beyond the cost of goods gives a lot more than profit. Profit is a little bit that's left over after the reinvestment that a particular company makes in the company that they're operating. And in this case, housing companies, many of the housing companies are more interested in building more housing, so they don't take profit. They turn the margin back into further and greater
Well,
development.
my point isn't that, that reasonable people can differ on the extent of the amount of money that profit represents on any given project, but one of the reasons why I'm an advocate of nonprofit housing developers is because they at least say that one of their motives is nonprofit as opposed to profit, and I think nobody would disagree, and that's why I think that, and I get it, you copied this, you didn't create this, but I would just say that profit is a factor. It's a factor in at least for-profit housing. It's a factor. It's maybe not a dominant factor. Maybe it's like the grocery industry where the profit margin is said to be under 1%. It's a very competitive business, and virtually all the money you're paying when you pay for your groceries is going for all those other things, and only a tiny sliver is going to go for the profit of the business. Where in other businesses, the profit is larger. And I don't know what it is in housing.
Very, very slim.
I suppose it'd be higher in the
For most
profit.
housing.
It'd probably be in the profit
Yeah, the risk
part.
is huge.
Probably be, for a profit-oriented company, it would be greater than for nonprofit.
So for our meeting here, I just want to go back to, earlier in our meeting, we had the call outs, and I just want to go back to making sure that we keep our hands raised and asking in turn so we can keep this moving a little bit quicker. And Commissioner Murray, you're next.
Because I obeyed the rules. I would like to make just a couple of comments on this chart and this discussion. One, nothing bad intended, but that's a very superficial view of profit. Materials suppliers have profits, or else they wouldn't be in that business. Labor costs are often charged to things by contractors who have profits, or they wouldn't be in the business. In the private housing field, without a profit, you won't have developers come in. Oftentimes, and I'm sure you'll get into this, a role of government is looking at how strategically you can utilize public dollars to incent massive private investment, so that the tail is kind of wagging the dog, but in a good way for the public purpose. I'd also like to speak very briefly on financing. I want to share one experience for how important financing can be, and it doesn't just mean subsidizing. In the business I had before I retired, one of the things that we did was we created a new finance type that actually allowed the Catholic Church to meet the climate encyclical of the Pope, because in that instance, and it gets very granular, but in that instance, just to speak to the utility of creative financing, all dioceses have covenants and conditions with all of their parishes and rectories and schools, all of their real estate. And those covenants and conditions precluded debt. So we created a new finance type which adhered to the covenants and conditions. And within a year after creating that new finance type, we were able to put solar on 49 of the rooftops and parking lots just in the San Diego diocese. So I'm not trying to say anything other than I think we really need to look at the goal and understand how this is actually a really good chart. And within each of those subcategories, there's a lot of room, I think, for the county to carve a path forward, which I'm looking forward to the recommendations. Thank you.
I just wanted to add, since it was brought up by Commissioner Vosovich, also regarding this first right of refusal program. Back in the day, I was tasked with rewriting what is written in our code now about this. And if it's still the same as then, we're of course going through a huge crunch of funds. It used to be that first nonprofits would be asked if they were interested in these properties, and if they weren't, then alternate options would be available. But it was having a hard time funding its own division. So it became first, we'll sell as much as we need in order to fund the division, and if there's some left over, then we could ask our nonprofits, none of which have clear titles. And if you're to eventually utilize these lands for some kind of additional housing for the county, you're not going to get a lender who's going to be interested in partnering if you can't clear that title. So being able to clear those titles, even for the private people, could take a good 10 years if they didn't go through the process correctly. And so I just wanted to share that little bit of information. I don't think it's changed since then, but it's very possible, and that would be a good review for us.
Good historical perspective.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's see. So this next big bucket, and a few other questions that came up, we'll touch on in the following slides, is new partnerships and pilot programs. And the first bullet point is fairly high level, but again speaks to a unique role that we think the county can and should play in our conversations about Lane County's housing crisis. And that is to lead a multi-jurisdictional partnership program to track supply, affordability, and population change. Now, there are bills that have been passed in the last legislative session, House Bill 2003, that will really kind of level up for some communities' understanding of housing needs. But one thing that we notice happening continually in our conversation about housing is that there's not good data that is being shared that people can understand about where we are relative to where we have planned to be. And some of this is actually not that difficult to capture and track. It's not the type of information that needs to be panicked over week by week or even month by month, but over time, within larger areas, certainly within Eugene, Springfield metro area, to have an understanding of how we're doing relative to our goals, because people experience the hardship that goes along with us falling short in real time, and we oftentimes are not really talking about that until sometime into the future when a new process is evaluating, sort of where we were. So it's a big picture piece of work, but certainly plugs into other work in ways in which the county is thinking about moving forward with TAC coordination. and bigger picture in Eugene Springfield. Even some of the points that came up in conversation the other week around how everyone is, at the table and working together around the clock in all the different ways. Second point here is something that we've heard from partners who are really interested in taking advantage of existing housing supply and better coordinating home share, essentially room boarding programs. Home share is, if you're not familiar, is an approach to thinking about housing which oftentimes is seen as an intergenerational resiliency strategy where you are literally taking on a new member of your household into a spare room. It's also a strategy that constituencies interested in micro-dwelling and much sort of smaller housing configurations and types are interested in. And the county would be a reasonable place for that program to be housed as a part of a network of partnerships because it's a uniform or a unified housing market that people are looking at across these areas. Outreach to local financial institutions, this has to do with a couple of different programs and certainly that plugs into that financing piece. There's a lot, I think, that could be done in this space because we're seeing banks and financial institutions evolve as housing supply opportunities and the market evolves. A first point in that outreach process would be around ADU construction loans, and that as ADUs are becoming a more common part of how we think about every home in our state, to make sure that it's as feasible as possible for individual homeowners to contribute something to our housing solutions, being that small unit on site. We are already seeing, I think, Umpqua Bank may be the only regional bank that currently has folded in income projected from ADU rental to their home mortgage program. That significantly influences understanding of what income is and mortgage qualification rates. So that could be a place where we see some progress for middle incomes who are having trouble accessing a mortgage. And then finally, some work around missing middle housing appraisals process and engagement possibly with our local credit unions, banks, filling in the gap between what we understand to be typical products in our community and what will be more emerging, and making sure that we don't fall into the hole of projects not being feasible because they don't have financing support. Lastly, on this page, to study leverage funds and also zero interest revolving loan programs to incentivize specifically more mixed income and workforce housing. I was just mentioned at that panel at the U of O and talking with a local grassroots developer who is working very hard to deliver ownership workforce housing in new construction into this market. Very difficult thing to accomplish, essentially sub-market ownership housing. And there is almost no support for that type of work, and yet it is this huge chasm in terms of our housing policy. There are very large projects that can qualify for types of support, and there are maybe our more typical capital A, capital H affordable housing programs, but there is not very much that lives in the world that we need for our public agencies and elected officials to address, which is all of the housing that we expect people to be able to eventually access. And these are smaller unit types. They are potentially projects that have multiple different levels of income incorporated into one project. They are projects that are coming to the market at 80% to 100% of AMI. We're not seeing that in any way currently. And we think that that is a place where, given our wages, our community, our kind of spatial context, we could see real progress and a sense of support.
Commissioner Burden.
A placeholder, perhaps, hopefully, for our further discussion, and that is that I have spoken to the chief lending officers of two large local financial institutions about a little more granularly what ironically, what a zero interest revolving loan fund could look like, which would also include zero interest down payment assistance and structure it in such a way, right? I would love to share with you the results of that and the interest of that amongst the lender community that I've spoken with.
That's wonderful.
Thank
Would love to have that conversation. My guess is we've maybe talked to even a few of the same people, because there is interest, especially from our local institutions, to make sure that the path to homeownership stays open for people here.
Well, every financial institution that makes home mortgages has an interest in this. Yeah, thank you.
Commissioner Swanton?
Just want to drill down a little bit more about the revolving loan program, and we're going to get into it a little later in our meeting today, actually, because one of the things that government can do is it can create, by its taxpayers' willingness, it can create an amount of money that can fund a revolving loan program. And I'm wondering if you have any examples where other local governments comparable to Lane County, who are slightly larger or slightly smaller, have done that.
Our understanding is that every jurisdiction has kind of its own constellation of strategies that it uses to fund its housing objectives. I think we would absolutely encourage the county to take a thoughtful approach and to look at those strategies and understand and kind of the trade-offs, the pluses and minuses, the feasibility, how those different strategies align to the specific goals that you have set, and then move forward.
So how much money would make a dent in this problem of mixed income and workforce people not being able to buy into housing because they don't have the amount of money it takes to put down to start buying a house?
So what I would say is that it depends on the project and the context, but that would be a reason to actually develop or study a program. Because in some cases, relative to other investments, it's again that sort of strategic use of public dollars. It's not that the public dollars have to fill the whole capacity of the project. It's that they have to be leveraged dollars. In some cases, that's thinking about different in the process of development. Not all dollars have the same cost associated with them. Some dollars are more expensive to access than others, and those are places of leverage for an entity that has capital or the ability to loan funds.
Yeah, thank you.
Commissioner Farr?
That last thing you said, Karen, really blends into what the question I was going to ask. Some dollars are more expensive than other dollars. That's a really important concept to understand, because zero interest loans are pretty cheap dollars as far as the borrower is concerned. So my question actually went back to something you said about Umpqua Bank. You said they're the only local institution that's factoring in the possible income potential for the ADU.
Regionally, that's our understanding currently, though.
And we have examples. For instance, Springfield's been pretty aggressive with ADUs. I think they have probably 15 or 20 of them in process right now. Is Umpqua Bank working over there?
I don't know if anyone is even taking advantage of that opportunity, because what is different about this example is that if you already have your home mortgage and you are building an ADU, you would likely apply for some kind of construction loan against your mortgage. If you are trying to buy a house for the first time, what's different about this program is that financial institutions are factoring in the rental income from that property, and so it adjusts your sort of mortgage viability, which is very different from where we were a few years ago.
And that's how you describe it, that it adjusts your mortgage viability, and because that's a really big issue right now for people getting into homes. You have people who are buried by rental payments when they could actually be paying less on a mortgage if they had
If they could get into a home.
If they could get into the home. And finding creative ways to do it through a zero interest revolving loan fund or through banks willing to work. If you can buy a property that potentially has an ADU on it, then you can use that to help finance your principal residence. All these creative ways to get people into housing that aren't aren't able to get in the house now. Your work is fantastic, by the way. You're going to a depth, a level that, as long as I've been working on this, you're going deeper in some areas, really creating some novel thoughts about how jurisdictions can work together with private industry.
Well, that is absolutely what we would hope, and I will say,
Yeah.
I also feel like I'm kind of skipping across the surface given the ways in which these conversations can quickly head down into their own individual rabbit holes. But
Yeah.
seeing the landscape, that there are a lot of different ways that we could work, and that it also doesn't have to all be the county.
Mhm.
Part of it is just the leadership and the stance that we take relative to some of these challenges, how strategic outreach happens so that there are more partners coming to the table who are interested in supporting, the community's success.
And a part of your research, just one little follow-up on this, and I'm going to look at Lori Truther over there, because Lane County did the same thing, identify what is it that caused people to get disqualified from the mortgage or from the ability to get into their own home. Lori worked for Lane County, and why are people hungry? And it's the same thing, why is this happening? And taking individual cases and beginning to address it at a root level rather than hoping that what you're looking at is going to help the people. Look at what's causing people to be in the dilemma and then model a plan. That seems to be what you're doing. I mean, that's...
We're trying to come at it from both sides at the same time.
From all 18
From all,
sides.
yes, from all 49
There are only
sides.
8. Good, well, thank you, and thank you, Chair.
Commissioner Brady?
Karen, I'm sorry that she was also had to be the subject of my heaping praises upon her after the last presentation. I want to unwrap something to talk about this cost of $1 is $1 a dollar. And I want to say, and this is in fact supportive of saying we should study and plan and think it through before we immediately. Take the notion, the concept of a zero interest revolving loan fund. Think in terms of a finite period of time, let's say 9 to 12 months, that zero interest is available to a contractor to build X number of homes. Think that maybe let's take in 9 months, that zero interest loan has to be paid off. It has to be paid off by a market rate loan that an existing financial institution offers. All of a sudden, those dollars for the public sector that provided financing become even cheaper because they're reimbursed. Think in terms of the, and another thought, I'm sorry, it's not really a rabbit, it's an integrated rabbit hole. It's a network of connected rabbit holes. Think also for a moment about down payment assistance that can be structured in a similar way, where it's repaid upon either the sale of a home or a certain point in the person's income viability. Think in terms of the impacts on real estate appraisers, which I see in here, which one could change in terms of valuing this work, and think even in terms of some sort of a realtor indication on an MLS service identifying whether there is an existing or possible ADU potentiality. So all I'm trying to point out is that the deeper down we go, the more leverage we can create for any small amount of public dollars to create more housing at less cost for the public sector. I'm sorry to take you.
We would agree, and that first proper noun, leverage funds, that's a term that many jurisdictions use as kind of their catch-all way of describing the many different ways that they think about some of those issues and how it is that they're trying to steer opportunity within the local market to fill more of the local need. The next big bucket, coming back to something that was raised earlier by Commissioner Sorensen, support the workforce and skilled trades. So in working with our local analysts from the Oregon Department of Employment, we understand Lane County to still be at pre-recession levels of employment within our construction industry. That is not good news. relative to our objectives of delivering more affordable housing and more housing, period, even taking the affordability component out of it. That lack of skilled labor drives higher costs, presents project delivery challenges, is many different ways that it cascades as a challenge within the community. So one piece of this puzzle that is certainly upstream, but we have a local asset that we could think more aggressively about partnering with, is the development of a community college trade pipeline. And in being in a community that has Lane Community College, has other educational institutions that could help us to be better tooled up to address our local housing crisis, that is something that we would just like to see a more clear connection between. And that similarly to, I was thinking back to the recession, and during a period of time where if I wanted to go and get my welding certificate, I could have just done that as a part of essentially a program to build my capacity to be employable at a time when the market, there would be jobs waiting or available again. And we would like to see, even in the smallest of pilots, a way of better taking advantage of the construction program that we have here locally in our community college. It's a great opportunity for grassroots economic development, building resilience, but also delivering capacity into an area of our community that we desperately need more people to be rooted and invested in. That's related to these next two bullet points, that also looking to develop local design-build partnerships. That term design-build in this case is used relatively informally, not design-build as the project delivery strategy, but instead, again, looking at some finer grained strategies by which we might be able to accomplish some distributed affordability and distributed housing supply strategies. So specifically looking at partnering with LCC Construction or the UO Builds program. At a recent Better Housing Together event, I met an instructor who teaches construction to 90 women a term. And I found myself wondering, as she was showing me examples of the projects they do, why they're not delivering units of housing out of that learning process. Because all they would need is maybe some funding for materials, but it would be a very fine-grained and sort of slow accumulation of supply, but would be consistent and pay multiple dividends in thinking about how capacity is being delivered and also product is being delivered through that process. So that's one example. Two other examples are support for incremental development alliance workshops. That's essentially one organization nationally that works to build grassroots development capacity. Once we have regulatory structure that works, you still need people who are willing to step into that space and actually do the risky work of developing housing, especially if you are a individual who's thinking of trying to accomplish this somehow. It takes skills and support in order to be able to do that. And then finally, some work around new opportunities with missing middle housing with the Construction Specifications Institute and AIA, and thinking about how it is that we continue to encourage our workforce to be prepared for the opportunities that are coming directly. Those are relatively simple steps, but that also would build relationships and help to prepare us for the future that is here, actually, here right now.
Commissioner Burney.
The woman you spoke with, was she with the group Women in the Building Trades?
I do not know, but I know that group. I'm assuming so because she teaches the women's construction program.
Just FYI for future reference, Women in the Building Trades is a group. They do have a 7-week curriculum that feeds into all of the 14 different building trades. It's a really good curriculum. To my knowledge, they're Portland-centric, and they're looking for resources to expand to the rest of the state.
Thank you. Two last slides. So this next bucket is policy innovation for rural affordability, and rural meaning essentially outside of Eugene, Springfield, UGBs, possibly outside of some of our smaller cities. This is a collection of ideas that have come up in actually very diverse conversations. The first set of strategies has to do with thinking about how new opportunities for housing diversity can also support affordability outside of urban centers. There are pilot programs through an organization called Hacienda CDC that OHCS is looking to bring local pilot possibly to Lane County to support Better Housing Together. Very much wants to see that happen here. There are examples from Multnomah County from a number of years ago, wondering why, if we can deliver an ADU for $150,000 total cost onto someone else's land, don't we do that and then just ask for a 10-year duration of affordable housing? That's essentially the model that's moving forward in these other pilot projects. And that example from one commissioner or a handful of commissioners in Multnomah County from a few years ago, I don't believe moved forward in its example, but is, I think, continued to influence the ecosystem of thoughts about equity and affordability and housing diversity to the north. And then finally, just a note about modular construction and zero emissions modulars, pilots and partnerships. There's also a U of O project called the U of O Open Home project. And that's really looking at a way in which you might be able to integrate housing into locations where service delivery and infrastructure delivery is really just not feasible, not a great idea, certainly not a cost reasonable strategy, and that if you are able to instead incorporate housing that essentially operates off the grid, you may have some capacity to be able to meet that supply need in a financially reasonable way. These two last points, one is that we know that is currently a rare fellow who's working at the county to support Austin Ramirez's work and housing work that is happening here. I know the RARE program from some other engagement in Veneta and Monroe and Coburg, and we would encourage the county to maintain that partnership and also to use that partnership to support some of this coordinated conversations and outreach that we're describing, because there is a lot of work that just goes on with making sure that people understand how the world is changing and what new opportunities might be available to them. Lastly, this point about pursuing community land trust and limited equity cooperative models. This could be particularly influential and important in areas that are not necessarily going to have access to a lot of housing supply and production, but the challenge of maintaining some affordability and some path to home ownership is necessary to the stability of the community. So this falls into that same category probably as the leverage funds and thinking about zero interest revolving programs, but there are a lot of great examples of these models providing long-term stability and equity into communities that otherwise would not have a path to that. So we think that's pretty interesting. And some great models locally to learn from in that way, certainly Square One Village, Sorghum Villages, and others. Lastly, building capacity. So in our conversations, we've heard the most interest in terms of capacity building having to do with new partnerships, new pilots. People are hungry for innovation and to see sort of smart study and leadership and incremental progress against these challenges. There's been a lot of interest in leveraged funding and seeing dollars stretched and using the same dollar many times to accomplish a challenge, and also to looking at development incentives and ways in which the county can, again, steer partners and private industry towards the type of work that needs to be done. Cautions that were shared through some of these conversations to, of course, first explore alternatives for capacity and funding that don't increase the cost of housing. There's a lot of concern about the kind of different distortion and compression that is unique to our housing markets and properties, and that's just one point that was shared on a few occasions that we think is important. And then lastly, some real interest in sort of looking at all the tools that the county has and the ways in which funding and capacity can come to these challenges. I'm sure you all are well aware from even recent field trips and conversations, work that Multnomah County is doing around their homelessness crisis and the recent agreements between Multnomah County and the City of Portland to use essentially a portion of their transient room tax to fund both their tourism programs and homelessness. I think it's about maybe $5.25 million a year that has just been an agreement struck between those entities at the end of 2019. I think took quite a lot of work because they're funding homelessness services and wanted to be sure that in downtimes those services weren't going to be the first thing on the chopping block. We were curious for that same reason if instead looking at a program similar to that or similar types of funding streams to actually fund affordable housing and housing construction, and to think about those funds not being for services but instead to actually deliver more housing supply.
Commissioner Swartz?
On the transient room tax, are you saying that the state law is flexible enough to allow Lane County to use its TRT funding that we collect from hotel visitors? Actually, we collect it from the hotels, but the visitors pay the hotel. Are you saying that we have the current flexibility to use TRT for homeless services?
I would look at how Multnomah County and the City of Portland structured their agreement to answer that question. They have a little bit of a different structure already with their 11.5 plus the 2 that only applies sometimes, I think. But that is, I would certainly want to understand how it was that they found their path.
Mr. Mulcahy, do you have an opinion on that?
I don't have an opinion about it, but I can tell you what the legal analysis to date has been, and that is that the existing TRT, it really goes to how you've historically used the TRT that is currently imposed, and because Lane County has used our TRT for really exclusively tourism-related functions for Travel Lane County, for the Lane Event Center, for parks, and for, I think, the Historic Museum, that's how we have to use the existing. I think the question would be if there was new TRT, right? If there was an increase in the TRT, could that new amount be used for some portion other than? And I think so Karin is right that we should look at the Multnomah City of Portland experience to see, did they increase their TRT and then use the new amount for it? But
Is that what the plus 2% represents in the graph?
No, that's a separate 2% Portland lodging tax that appears only sometimes, from my understanding, on your hotel bill. And I don't understand when that is, like what the specifics of that is.
Depends on if you're nice.
New one for 2021, right?
No. It's existing, but it's separate from the 11.5, which is the part that
it's only for California residents.
maybe that could be.
Bravely spoken.
So that brings us really just about to the end of what we had to share with you today. Just, I guess, one last reminder as a final point that communicating strategies and progress, like what this approach is and how it is that we are addressing our needs and why it is that we can feel optimistic as a community about the efforts that we're putting forth, we see as being not like a bonus attached to this work, but necessary for the community to understand. And I'll just include this example, which I love the content of, but I don't actually find to be very accessible for most people. But this is the metro area's regional affordability housing framework, which really just describes different income levels, different strategies that might be used to supply housing and to address the challenges that people living with those different amounts of income encounter. and also how it is that units of housing are delivered within those different categories. So does the private market typically work within this area at all? How might you encourage it to work more in this area? Is this area supplied only by publicly funded affordable housing programs? Yes, then, just focus on thinking about those things. We think that it's important to see the landscape, to understand the housing that we have, and that relative to the housing we need, and then to also use that to focus our efforts on particular types of projects and different capacity depending on the land available.
Excellent.
And that is where we are at.
Well, thank you so much for that. I know we peppered in some questions and we've almost run out of our first hour together. Is there any final thought or question from any of the commissioners? Commissioner Bozard?
So just a couple final quick thoughts on rural ADUs. It was unfortunate yesterday that I argued against this, that the Association of Oregon Counties adopted some recommendations on rural ADUs from the Oregon Association of Planning Directors that basically says they want them on 2-acre lots or larger, which is kind of, the whole thought is if you get smaller lots, that's going to have more of an impact for some reason. I'm not quite sure why, because it tends to be the smaller rural residential lots are in either right up against existing communities, or they're in a community that's an unincorporated community like Mapleton that actually has a sewer district serving it. So it's something we need to look at is maybe trying to change the conversation of why it needs to be, because I actually think adding ADUs to large lots is actually having more of an impact on resource land because they tend to be out and further away. But that's just one thing. But going back to the great graphic about cost, the thing that's not on there is tax, property tax, and other taxes and how they drive that cost. Property tax is built into your supply and price of existing housing. It also really changes the cost of new housing because you've got to have that 12-month of for your taxes, insurance, and all that stuff that you have to set aside as part of your down payment. It really adds to the cost of a house. At the same time, it really gets into other costs and the other factors and all that. Now we're adding 0.57% on everything in the supply chain, leading up to that with the corporate activities tax. So, as we think about how we're going to, find revenue for some of the things you're suggesting, we should be very careful they're not things that actually add to the crisis by raising costs. I think we had a great presentation this morning from the city of Cottage Grove and the strategies they're looking at that are much more incentivizing and lowering barrier strategies. In particular, we approved on a unanimous vote their effort to set up a multi-unit property tax exemption to try and leverage some of their empty parcels downtown and get some multi-units built and some rental housing there. So just don't ignore that piece of what also drives cost up, and that's taxation.
Commissioner Sorensen?
Well, just for closing comments, I would say, number one, thank you very much for this presentation. It's obviously very thorough, and I think a lot of people are going to benefit from this on the videotape. So thank you for taking the time to put this presentation together. Secondly, I'm in favor of all the strategies you've mentioned. I think we should further refine which ones we're going to be pursuing more, but I would say, full speed ahead in terms of further consideration of all the strategies. And then last but not least, I would say that one of the biggest returns I think we will get is to promote the idea of home ownership. That while we have tremendous responsibilities and that we're not meeting in the humanitarian aspects of homelessness and how we're not taking care of the homeless population. I would say the big long-term that we should be, as a community, really continuing to work on is how do we get people to experience the benefits of home ownership? How do we get a community built where we have more than 50%, which I think is a City of Eugene number, where 50% of the people do not have either the ability or the willingness to be involved in the home ownership. And we, through models such as the revolving loan fund and other things, could be a factor in jumpstarting that. And I have a theory that home ownership is a real indicator of the buy-in of people that live in a community for the stability of the community. And if we're having large numbers of people, like half of the population, unable to get home ownership, government ought to be part of the solution. And if revolving loan funds and jumpstarting the financial community's interest in, in effect leveraging that money, I think we should be doing it.
Commissioner Farr.
Thank you. Ever so briefly, a couple of things. A part of building wealth in your own home, whether it be by adding AD or whatever it may be, a lot of that can be done through the do-it-yourself home improvement market. And that's not just a shameless plug. I mean, really, you can save a lot of money by doing it yourself and adding rooms, adding units to your existing property. But my question, and you didn't really touch on this, and it's regarding the City of Eugene. We use MUPD. Multiple unit property tax exemptions here. A lot of that has been used in the university neighborhood for university housing. We have a great deal of student housing that's been built, a lot of units of student housing, which don't add new housing units for residents, other than it creates housing units from where the students had lived before, which quite often were divided by plywood, so it's not exactly a one-for-one trade. Have you studied that very much, how the student housing market has a more or less a negative effect on the local housing market? And there's an adjunct to that also.
We did not look at that specifically or talk specifically about that either in workshops. I will say, I know the City of Eugene has changed its MUPD program and with regards to student housing. I think in response to some of the concerns that were raised from exactly your point. Interestingly, this has been somewhat of a surprise to me. Though it shouldn't be at all, because we see it in other communities. I have heard recently more interest in sort of mixed intergenerational scenarios with student housing projects. And I know there are a few individuals locally who would like to see that conversation advance. I think one thing that our public agencies, jurisdictions can do is, in every opportunity, especially when public dollars are involved, to steer housing outcomes towards quality built assets, and to make sure that the unit types delivered in that housing are something that could be used by many different types of households. But as things like home sharing and room sharing become a necessary reality for more people, I think that units that were previously imagined to only be suitable to college students are not being viewed that way.
That's a good point. And the home sharing and room sharing is increasingly viable, but it's also not undignified. It's not necessarily a bad thing, which at first blush you might think, oh my gosh, you're degrading people's standard of living. Well, you don't have to.
It's like how we always used to do it.
It's the way we did it.
A very normal part of our American housing history is the idea of having
Boarding houses.
Boarders or extended family or
with some
others.
shared facilities. And the last thing is that supply is always a big issue. No matter how we plan for home ownership or whatever it may be, if we don't have the places, then we're not going to fulfill it. And I've talked about student housing. The other one that we need to keep an eye on, I don't know how much you've thought about this, is the advent of the absentee landlord in the form of what's happening a lot in Eugene and in Florence and across the board right now is the Airbnb concept. That, not necessarily that particular brand, but that concept, where our housing stock is being traded for people's living livelihood and profit.
I think for the county to engage in the conversation around short-term rentals is useful to have that understanding of that broader market. I think it is very true that especially our coastal communities are impacted by that force in their housing supply.
And Florence has been hit, but not as hard as some of the other coastal communities, but it's coming. Tillamook County, the people who work there can't find a place to live there.
Commissioner Hardy.
First, Corey, I want to recognize you and tell you I really enjoyed your letter on senior homelessness. And Lisa, I'm sorry that I was unable to make the sponsors activity, but it sounds like the rest of the world was there. Karen, I think that wherever this gets us, the fact that Better Housing Together has organized such a strong collaborative of groups that historically have not always communicated with each other is huge as it relates to process. So thank you for that. My understanding is part of the final report going to be recommendations for this county board of commissioners on steps that you recommend the county look at or take? That's awesome. And when should we expect that again? After? I'm sorry, I can't read them.
It's teeny tiny. So our hope is that we are wrapping up this work by the beginning of May, is the timeline that we're looking at currently. And that would include, I think, a meeting with you all to review those recommendations and then handing off that plan.
Terribly exciting. I cannot even imagine how enthused Commissioner Farr must be as we see the fruition of so much of this. Because I know how long you've been working on this, sir. I envision that there will be a relationship moving forward for Better Housing Together to increase its capacity, as well as the County of Wayne and the various municipalities to increase our capacity, and in fact, build more housing, get more people sheltered. In that regard, I'm going to add two more asterisks. A friend of mine from high school created an institute at UC Berkeley, out of their School of Business of all things, and she's got a template that I think you will find very useful if you choose to expand your horizons. Second, you mentioned Hacienda Heights CDC and OHCS. A gentleman that was behind that particular pilot was a guy named Victor Merced. Victor Merced was Governor Kitzhaber's head of OHCS, and after that, he moved and became the executive director of Hacienda Heights. He's a close friend. He's in retirement on the Road River, and I would love an excuse to get him to help you help us. That's
We always say yes to help.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Commissioner Bozard.
Thank you. I just had one item I meant to mention, I forgot. The idea of land trusts and that ownership of land outside of the ownership of the actual brick and mortar. My first home I bought, I paid ground rent. So, that on the East Coast, that's not an unusual thing. It's normal. I think it was $99 a year ground rent I was paying on my row home, which is a missing middle that we don't have here. So, that concept, and Dev Northwest just broke ground on a land trust development in Florence. But moving those two concepts, the idea of row housing, but brick and mortar on land trusts. The thing that's got a bad taste on the West Coast is the idea of manufactured housing on ground rent, because those have been turned over, and then, because it's a mobile house, you're asked to, depart with your house that no longer really has equity as a manufactured home. So, so brick and mortar on land trust land, I think, is a great strategy to look at, and trying to promote that and get people more acceptable of it here could be a big way into getting that housing more affordable.
Absolutely, I agree. Cottage Grove did the same thing, and it's also a way to keep it affordable in perpetuity. And almost in a way, a form of land banking.
It's affordability banking, and equity banking.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I've worked with Hacienda in the past, they're fabulous, would love to see them have that pilot down here. And however I can support that, I would like to be able to encourage that. The rural affordability for me is a big deal. And I know it looks very different, we talked about that earlier this morning, and I look forward to your final report in May, and hopefully keeping the momentum alive. So thank you so much for coming,
Thank you. Thank you all very
and
much.
we'll see you in a few months. So we'll move to item 13B, which is an order and resolution 20-02-11-11, in the matter of approving a resolution denouncing white nationalism in Lane County. And with us is Mo Young, Equity and Access Coordinator for the county. And if you want to, we'll give you a minute to get that together. And if you have anybody else you want to introduce, please do so.
All right. Well, to that direction.
You're that direction.
I was gonna say to your right or your left, but maybe
Yeah.
that way. Is Corey Rodley, who's the chair of the Equity and Access Advisory Board for one more month, and Lori Trieger, who just had her last meeting. She's welcome to come to any meetings.
Mr. Wetzel, sorry.
So
Thanks, Jen.
Laura Vincent made some copies, and you all get to see my highlighter, so now you get to know what I'm here ready to talk about. And I just want to, I know, now you have insight into my brain is what's happening. I wanted to just talk about a couple of things and then just open it to you all. And I was thinking this morning, it's not every day I get to talk about white nationalism at work, so it's kind of exciting and a little bit scary. So I'm going to start with why this and why now. White nationalism attempts to hold onto and wield power to weaken our democracy and to disenfranchise people of color. And just yesterday afternoon, I attended a talk by Guy Uriel Charles at the U of O during the Derek Bell Lecture Series. And he said something that really resonated with me that I thought I would share with you, which is we must be fully committed to the eradication of the problem, root, and branch. So it's important that we pass this resolution now because speaking out against bigotry is an important and also not the only step in ensuring that Lane County is the best county in which everyone can live, work, and play. You all have access to what I've highlighted, but I'm gonna just pull a couple of things out of the analysis. So both Lane County and the state of Oregon have racist governing histories, including the forceful removal of indigenous communities from their ancestral lands and continued refusal to recognize tribes. Oregon entering the Union as a whites-only state and the state's refusal to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, as well as enacting black exclusion laws. It's important to note that recently there's been a rise in white nationalist, white supremacist, and alt-right groups in the U.S., and specifically here in the state of Oregon. Recent gains in establishing policies and values that create a better place for all who live and visit here will only be sustained if we also acknowledge the impact that our state's history has of exclusion and racism. So just a quick timeline, and then I'm gonna hand it over to you all. So in 2009, I found in the archives of Lane County's board orders, there was a resolution censoring hate speech and displays. Fast forward to July of 2019, so 10 years later, a group called Communities United Against Hate forwarded a resolution to the Equity and Access Advisory Board asking for that board to bring it to Steve to bring to you all. He brought that draft at the end of August, on August 27th of 2019, where there was a brief discussion, there were some concerns, and the Equity and Access Advisory Board took that feedback from this group and came up with a new draft resolution, which is what you have in front of you today. And some of those, I think maybe the biggest thing that they took from this group is the request for definitions. And so you'll see that included in the board packet. And the advisory board approved the resolution at the December 2019 meeting. And that brings us to today.
Thank you very much. Any comments, questions, statements from any of the commissioners? Commissioner Parr.
Thanks. It wasn't the last meeting, but the meeting before where the commission discussed the inclusion of definitions. That was a pretty robust discussion that you had that night. And really, I think you did a good job of filtering it down into a very, not manageable, but a very presentable and understandable document. But really, I have no questions on it at this point in time, so bravo.
Commissioner Sorensen.
Number one, it sounds like the EAAB meeting was long and thoughtful, as the memo points out. Did they vote on the specifics of the resolution? Or did they? Yeah.
Yeah, they're the ones who drafted it.
Okay, so we're not talking about the Board of Commissioners drafting this, we're talking about the Board of Commissioners approving it.
Yep.
And that it's been drafted by a thoughtful group of people. Yeah, I think it's good, and also, in the more recent period where the people are being much more open about white nationalism than before. I feel like it's more and more in our face as leaders, and I can only imagine what it feels like to be the actual victim as opposed to a generic victim of this white nationalism. Also, the anti-Semitism is on the increase. We've had a lot of these other things for a long time, but it seems like the anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, white nationalism. When it's appropriate, I'll be happy to move approval.
Commissioner Bernay.
I enthusiastically am going to support this. I want you to know that I chatted with, I only had a chance to chat with 3 friends of mine, all of whom went to the U of O before African Americans were allowed to own property in the state of Oregon. And they were all astonished that this is all, that this is the entirety of the statement that we're being asked to support. I just wanted to share that feedback with you for what it's worth, and with the rest of our board. I'm in.
Commissioner Boswich.
So, this is an interesting resolution before me because I've been taking a stance where I've been voting against resolutions in general, because if they don't have anything beyond the resolution, if there's not action, funding, or policy change with it, it's kind of just virtue signaling and meaningless. In this particular case, I'm going to break that rule, partly because if I did vote for that reason, the only thing that would be advertised is my no vote, and that somehow that meant I was supporting white nationalism, which, I believe any form of racism is wrong. I like to say I'm a racist. I'm for the human race, no matter what you are. But I grew up in a much more diverse community on the East Coast. In fact, I lived in a neighborhood where I was a Gentile in a neighborhood that was 95% Jewish. And so I knew what it was like to be in the minority. I also lived in an area that had a lot of diplomatic families. So one of my best friends in elementary school was a Muslim whose parents were from Pakistan. And in fact, because of that connection, our class actually got to go visit a mosque in 1967. as fifth graders and understanding that culture. And I've had friends from all sorts of cultures through my lifetime, and in fact, my wedding party included 2 African-American men who in 1982 had people refuse to take their arm to come down the aisle in North Carolina at our wedding. So, I understand the issue of racism, and I appreciate, what some of these communities have been through. But some of the language in here, and particularly the term alt-right, I really don't particularly care for, because it's a label that's been placed on some of these groups, and some of them happen to be socialist, which does not make them right-wing at all. And it kind of connects them with a certain political party, which they're not necessarily connected with at all. Which I kind of wish that term wasn't in the resolution, but I'm going to ignore it and approve it. But I dislike any form of racism, whether it's the new Black Panthers, or the, I'll mess up the term, but the Black Israelites that have been extremely anti-Semitic. And I dislike any form of political violence. What's been going on with Antifa up in Portland is despicable. On any side of the spectrum, no one should use violence, intimidation, and as a means to political ends. So I will be supporting the resolution. I think that the Equity and Access Board has done a really good job of refining some of the language. The first version that came to us, I would have probably maybe reluctantly voted for, but would have really done with a lot of heartburn. There's only one whereas in here that bothers me. So you at least got it down to one. Other than that, there is no room. I voted without a problem for our resolution in December of 2016. By the way, it was December, not November. Because it took us that long to put it together after the election. It came before the board the first week of December. But in that case, there was no specific, group called out or anything like that. It was more supporting inclusion. It was a positive resolution about making sure all of our community felt welcome, rather than attacking one particular movement or group of people in sort of a negative fashion in some ways. So I still greatly support that resolution of we really need to be welcoming to all our community members. Just as I was exposed to on the East Coast, there's a lot of value in being inclusive and bringing all those points of view into our organization, like we honored Mo and Laura Vinson this morning for their work. And I just hope that we can maybe think about rather than resolutions and declarations, staying on that action oriented, because you were hired in 2016, and you were hired as a result of part of our strategic plan at the time, which was the prior board that made that a priority. That equity and access and inclusion in our organization was important. So it's been a principle and a policy of this board. That's where I think we should be focusing, is on those principles, policies, and putting them in our strategic plans rather than just declarations because somebody asked us to make a declaration. So I will be voting yes, though.
Well, thank you. Thank you for bringing this forward. I want to acknowledge that this body, the people here, we come from a place of privilege, and this is coming from people that don't have that same kind of privilege. We have privilege of having white skin. We have privilege of being an elected body. Whatever we can do in order to advance the inclusion of everybody in our community is what we should be working on every day, and that is, of course, why it's in our strategic plan. I think there's a balance in everything. There's a balance in action of our everyday work. There's also a balance of making sure that when we know something's wrong, we say it, and we say it loud. And I would love to be able to do that more often. And I'm pleased that we can do that today with this particular resolution, where it looks like everybody's on board as well. So when there are other things that come up that require a body to make a powerful statement in our values and our beliefs, I think we should be doing that, just as this has come forward today. Commissioner Burney?
We were going to make a motion, I presume?
I think Commissioner Sorensen was going to make a motion, but I was just going to mention. So you had your hand up 1/2 second before I did.
No. I was going to make a motion, but then there'll be further discussion. Would you rather make your statement first?
Is ever so brief, under the therefores, I was gonna ask if maybe Corey Rodman could read the therefores out loud. I'd love to hear that, but, we can wait until after the motion has been made. The second therefore is that the Board of Commissioners recognizes the importance of elected officials responding publicly, exactly what you just said. So we're resolving to do exactly what you just said, and I think you're right. If you see it happening, you do something about it while it's happening. Don't wait and talk about it later, and don't hope and expect somebody else will talk about it.
Corey, do you want to just read a paragraph, and then we can go towards adoption?
Sure. Good thing I brought my reading glasses. You never know. Now, therefore, the Board of County Commissioners of Lane County orders and resolves as follows. 1, the Board of Commissioners support Lane County being a welcoming, inclusive, and safe community for everyone who lives, learns, works, and plays in Lane County. We condemn actions that promote hate, xenophobia, racism, white supremacy, white nationalism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, sexism, and other forms of bigotry. 2, the Board of Commissioners recognizes the importance of elected officials responding publicly, as in, examples, press release, press conference, when groups or individuals experience hate and bias activity in order for the affected communities to feel supported. And 3, the Board of Commissioners applauds the recent state legislation, Senate Bill 577, requiring a system to track incidents of hate and bias, and will work with staff to allocate resources and implement the system in conjunction with other jurisdictions.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Burney?
I move approval of the resolution denouncing white nationalism in Lane County.
Second.
All right, we have move approval by Commissioner Burney, second by Commissioner Farr. Any discussion? I think we've had our discussion, really. So we'll move to a vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much for bringing this forward.
Sorry, Corey, but I'm glad you brought your glasses.
Oh, I'm glad I got my glasses too. Thank you. Good work. Thank you,
Okay.
Mom.
We'll move on to item 14 for the board. A work session discussion regarding options to help with housing and homelessness and discuss finding other local revenue options. Brought to us by Commissioner Sorensen.
Brought to you by.
Brought to you by. Well, I wanted to bring this conversation or discussion up at a board meeting. I did not want to have a big staff presentation on it. Not that that wouldn't be useful, but I think sometimes in trying to describe what we want, it takes more energy than just having a discussion. And then if there's sufficient interest, moving on to more finite or definite ways of implementing that discussion. And our county administrator's uniquely equipped to do that, should there be a board interest. My reason for bringing this up is that several opportunities when we've talked about different types of housing problems such as the TAC report, or more recently today in our meeting today, the people that are working on these things tend to be reluctant to talk about how much money is going to be needed and over what period of time the money is going to be needed. And I don't blame presenters for not wanting to talk about that, because that is among the most sensitive and difficult parts of the solution to the problem. I also think it's something where we as policymakers shouldn't, kind of shirk our duty in terms of, well, if these things are important, how are we going to try to pay for them? And I'll just say that, as I did in the previous work session today, I think home ownership is a really important part of the American dream. And there's many different ways of having home ownership, as was discussed earlier, but we are losing the ability of more and more people to get that part of the American dream. And I also think a lot is being done on the topic of homelessness. I think a lot is being done by this county government, but as we can tell, the numbers just seem to grow and grow. So my solution to all this isn't really anything other than to prepare ourselves with data and with information about the willingness of Lane County voters to pay additional taxes to support a variety of different ways that we can help with housing issues in our community. And so my ask of the Board of Commissioners, and what I would like to see us do eventually, is to direct staff to commence some public opinion analysis of whether or not people are willing to support property taxes, increase property taxes for housing, and to make it as palatable as possible for voters to say that would be something in the public interest. For example, I think the revolving loan fund that you maybe heard me talk about before, as a way of combining the hard work of people that are trying to buy housing and get into the home ownership, there are barriers to that. And yet, the cost of owning a home and living in a home that you own is actually, in many cases, lower than the cost of renting a home. And so you don't get the stability in society. Well, I don't know if voters have ever been asked if they would pay property taxes to support something like that. So my goal in this discussion is to get us talking about and I view this as inevitable, that inevitably we will come up against the fact that it costs money to do some of the things that will be recommended down the road, and yet none of the other people that I'm aware of have the authority or the resources to direct our county administrator to start looking at the attitudes of Lane County voters so that it will frame a discussion of whether it's even possible to raise money in that fashion. If it isn't, obviously, we would have to adjust our ideas in the future, that if it wasn't possible, then we wouldn't be able to continue to advocate for that. We more likely want to change our views and look for some other way of doing it. But at least for now, my idea is we'll try to get a ongoing public opinion survey and ask staff to figure out ways of asking the question, so that down the road, if we ever do think that additional resources are necessary, we'll at least have some background. Will they support money for women and children? Will they support money for homeless veterans? What is their tolerance level for this? Is it high, medium, or low, or non-existent? So that's what I'm hoping that we can do. And I don't see that coming from the Poverty and Homelessness Board, or the Housing Policy Board, or our contract with Better Housing Together. That's just not on the agenda of any of those organizations, and yet ultimately in the back of our minds, well, if the federal government's gonna turn their back on us, how are we going to provide in our own community? So that's my basic intro to this discussion.
Any response, comments? Commissioner Farr?
Well, I've spoken about this before, property taxes. I've not spoken about property tax before, but about funding affordable housing. Property taxes are one means that can be used, but back in 1996, 1997, the city of Eugene had a committee. It's a council committee to finance affordable housing. It was a pretty broad committee, included, each councilor had 2 appointees to the committee, and then there were 3 councilors on the committee also. And we worked for about a year discussing all of the options, including property taxes, including sales taxes and various other options. And the option that committee came up with was a 1% utility fee. Now, it had flaws. It failed at the ballot box. It failed pretty well, with greater than 60% no. But it wasn't a measure that we pushed very hard. We didn't really explain it very well. And in terms of cost per household, it was about $1 a month, about $1 a month, which would have generated about $1 million a year back in 1997, which would have gone directly to housing. It failed. We didn't go back with it. The flaws included the fact that it was just EWEB customers. It was just the city of Eugene, and people were able to pick it apart, even though it cost less than a cup of cheap coffee per month, per household. So since then, and in just this last year, Multnomah County did pass a pretty big ballot measure that puts a lot of money into housing in Multnomah County. Portland has done the same. So the will of people to support housing is definitely there if they're able to understand what they're getting from it. And I believe that's the flaw that we had in 1997 when we put the 1% utility fee out that failed so miserably. Now imagine if we'd been able to pass it in 1997, or if we'd gone back and got all the yes votes back and convinced a few no votes that we needed to convince to pass it. If we'd had that $1 million a year since then, where would we be today? So the time to do it isn't tomorrow. The time to do it, if we're going to be able to do it, is now. It's got to be a way that people understand, and that people will understand that their contribution is recognizable, easy to measure, and they will see the benefits of making it happen. So, Commissioner Swanson, you talked specifically about property taxes, and that is, without sales tax in Oregon, that really is the means that we lean on quite a bit. But I'm afraid that we lean on it a lot, and I'm afraid that we lean on it so much that people start out with a no on it unless it's directed for a school district, and then they work toward yes. So I welcome this discussion, because we do need to do something to finance affordable housing. That's not the right term, to finance housing in our community, that will get people who want to live in a house, living in the house. So a good beginning to the discussion. And my first question, Pete, was why aren't staff here? Why is Manila not here? Well, you explained it perfectly.
Yeah, I think that if the board doesn't want to move in the direction of finding out about voter attitudes, then I don't think we should really be involving staff. Staff, I think, generally understands that there is going to be no additional revenue. That's not an assumption that I think is stated openly, but I think that until there is revenue, I think it will be given that you might have recommendations from here and there saying you should prioritize and spend more money on this or that. So there might be some recommendations to spend money, but there won't be any big ticket recommendations from staff, knowing that our budget is constrained, knowing that voters have turned down many of the measures we put in front of them. But my point is, I don't think they've ever been asked in any systematic way of whether they think the housing dilemma with working housing or middle housing or homelessness justifies some level of 5-year property tax limitation, property tax measure. We don't know because we haven't asked. And my point is, well, if we don't if we don't make the recommendation to staff to do this in February, then I guess we could always do it in March or April, but every time we don't have a discussion of it, it means that we're, or the board, I should say, beyond my current term of office, but the board will be left to its own opinions of whether or not a given property tax or tax proposal is something the public will support. If we started doing this analysis over time, we'd have tracking information. We might even have different companies doing the polling, because we've had experiences with polls done by particular companies that didn't particularly work out. And I'm just in favor of getting more information. And then if a board decides, no, the public doesn't support it, then why put it out for a vote? Why not anticipate the likely outcome and go, no, we shouldn't put that out. Even though there is a huge demand, and even though the board wants to do more, maybe we shouldn't put it out. On the other hand, we shouldn't be blinded by any kind of fear. If the public sees this as a major problem, they do, in my view, they do see it as a major
More than
problem.
ever.
Yeah,
More than ever.
and one difference, and I think you would agree too, in terms of what happened to the Eugene utility proposal, is imagine the impact of housing on our society in that period of Eugene history versus this period of Lane County history. I would say housing is a much more dominant issue now.
Absolutely. Yeah. Exponentially more dominant issue.
Any other thoughts, comments? If not, I'll chime in, but Commissioner Rosich?
Yeah, I'm not terribly enamored of the idea of going to property taxes to raise money for affordable housing. It's one of those costs that goes into the cost of housing. And I hear from a lot of my community, and remember that Census District 5 that they outlined that was so hard to get people to respond to? There's a lot of older folks out in that area that their largest single expense annually is their property tax, that are on Social Security. So as we think about property taxes, it can be the tipping point for some people between staying housed and unhoused. Not to mention, I don't think we have seen yet the impact of the corporate activities tax and what that's going to do to housing costs, as well as what it's going to do to cost of living in general for Oregonians. Recently, a school district was handed on almost $200,000 change order to their bond construction contract for the additional cost of the corporate activities tax that the contractor was going to have to pay. So, that's what you're seeing is those things. And at the same time, there's 6 different bills to raise taxes in front of the legislature right now, including a lifting of the preemption of the transfer tax on housing, which is going to directly affect housing, a apartment construction tax, and the overall carbon tax, which could raise, again, all those construction costs for housing, because it also involves fuel costs, which, contractors have to pay for fuel. So now we're going to talk about, let's talk to people about raising their property taxes so we can take that money into government, hire some people that are PERS employees to run that program, pay prevailing wage, then to construct affordable housing for those people that are probably going to lose their houses because we're starting to tax them out of their houses. I'm just not interested. I don't think it's worth staff's time to go out and ask people, because I think it's the wrong revenue resource. If we had our historic O&C timber money, we'd be looking at how to spend $50 or $60 million a year on services and housing. But we're walking away from that conversation because we don't want to participate in the one organization that's advocating on behalf of harvest and or replacement dollars, or getting the trust in place that would give us that money. But, we're willing to walk into taxing people and raising the cost of housing. but we're walking away from holding the federal government responsible for their property they own here and making sure it's contributing to our services and our housing. Not to mention, if we're harvesting federal timber, that'll bring down the cost of housing because it'll bring down the cost of lumber.
Commissioner Bernie?
I don't think anyone I don't disagree with the intent here and the goal of providing shelter for all. I don't happen to know, well, I won't get into this and that. I would like to say talking tactics and strategy for a moment as opposed to goals and objectives. I know, and Steve, I hope you listen, I know that LCC is going on a big ballot initiative in May, which would be property tax based. I believe, I don't know, but I believe that the direction for the county is to go on a ballot initiative for the Justice Center as our last shot at getting a state match in November. I know that in May, Better Housing Together is going to provide a series of recommendations to this board, all of whom want to catalyze more construction of more alternatives and more options for financing, et cetera. So here's how I'm feeling for what it's worth. I think rather than go to the public now with questions, I would go after we get this is me. I would go after we got recommendations from the contract. We've awarded Better Housing Together to give us recommendations, and then discuss and debate those. I'm presuming there will be multiple options based on the presentation we heard. Some of them might be taxes, some of them might be eliminating barriers, some of them might be waiving SDC costs, some of them might be utilizing MUPDs. And what I would rather do is, after we get a sense of that, if there was going to be sort of an assessment of the appetite, is ask what components the public would like to see in a package that then would be forwarded. And I would like some definition of that package and that process to start, so that if and when we're pitching the Justice Center in November, we also are very clear to the public that we are, and they know through polling, that we are also assembling a package to spur quantitatively more housing options for the public, in the next thing. That's what I would like to do, so that the fatigue of everything being property tax based can be sidestepped, and the ability to look at various mechanisms of resource and then mitigation of the barriers and costs of construction can be a part of the package. So for what it's worth, I agree with you 100%, Pete, but that's my idea of tactics and strategies in terms of timing and how we go to the public and why.
I'm in much of the same boat. I think Better Housing Together is giving us that body of framework that we need to know about what options are out there. There's more options than I think we realize are available to us. And if they're not something that we know as elected body, certainly the community is not aware of them as well. Ultimately, we know that housing costs money. It's going to cost money for permanent supportive housing. It's going to cost money just for housing under 100% AMI. And it's very different for each demographic, and which demographic do we need to house more than any other demographic? Are we going to be picky about that demographic? All those questions are kind of up in the air, I feel, in the framework that I think Better Housing Together is setting up for us will build us to a successful point where if we do come to the public for funding, then we'll have every tool in the toolbox kind of laid out for us, and figuring out which one to grab as the timing and as the community says that's the tool we need now. But we have a little bit more homework to do. What I don't want is for people to start getting called about taxes in the middle of a 2020 election season when they're getting called for lots of other things that are on the ballot, either bond or otherwise, and not know exactly what we're calling to ask them for. Like, we want $50 million for permanent supportive housing or a combination of things. We need to be really specific and really have all of our ducks in a row to come out and start asking those questions. Because when, as Commissioner Bozovich said, out in our rural communities, you start getting calls about, hey, would you be willing to raise my property tax? And you don't have these specific things on the board, they're already not feeling the taxes are something that they really want to pay more for. They don't understand how it affects them in a beneficial way. Which means, to me, rural communities, if you're gonna be asking for money, those projects better be in those rural communities where they reach those voters, because it's gonna be really tough to come to them for an ask without being able to explain that. We have the same issue in many ways with the Justice Center and how to making sure that we message what we're doing for them and how it touches their lives every day. So I'll leave it at that. Commissioner Sorensen.
Well, let me just say a couple things. Number one, we could, in responding to the housing crisis that we've put out a resolution on, saying it is a crisis, we could ask all of the housing professionals, gee, what do you think you should do? And that would be one good approach. That's the approach we're following, by the way. Another one is, hey, community, we know there's a big problem out there. We'd like to know your willingness and tolerance to support doing something about this problem. Now, the advantage of doing it the way we're doing it is that we will eventually get a very good plan. And it might take a year. We already had the TAC report, so we could implement the TAC report, but we don't have enough money to implement the TAC report. So now we have a new report that's coming in May that'll be broader than the TAC report. And after we learn from that set of experts, we will now have a better plan. But nowhere along that way are we, the commissioners with the power to refer a tax to the voters, are we gently and continually asking what the public's attitude is, the voting public's attitude is about paying money. Now, it may well be that Jay and I would come to the same conclusion if we got this information, and that is the public won't support it. In which case, wouldn't it be a better decision for the board to say, sorry, experts who want more money for housing, I'm sorry, we won't be able to get that money through the voters because, as maybe Jay is predicting, and maybe I would be willing to accept if the data were there, the public isn't willing to support it. But I do believe this is a major issue, and the idea of measuring public attitudes over time will help the board down the road. As to whether 3 or 4 months will make a difference in the timing, it'll only make a difference in terms of how many more touch points could we have if we did this every 3 months. So maybe that is a good choice. I mean, people are being asked about property taxes. Maybe the last thing, in terms of the LCC vote or some other vote, maybe the last thing we need to do is initiate this prior to May. And so in that sense, I think waiting until May is quite reasonable, and also it dovetails with the timing of this other report. So maybe that's a good outcome for today.
Commissioner Bernie.
Thank you, I think it is. I also share your concern. The difference is what I hear Commissioner Sorensen saying is, let's find out whether it's possible or not based on the appetite of the voters. reminds me, and this is gonna sound bad, I apologize, of a cartoon where I saw had Nixon back then putting his finger in the air to see which way the wind was blowing. Everyone was running that way, and he said, "Wait for me, I'm your leader." You could name any politician, the same thing would work. So my feeling is the appetite's there. So rather than ask people no or yes, let's help them be part of getting to yes. That was all I was trying to say before. And the timing is such that I just think we would help them get to know if we did it too soon. But there is a window between May and November where we're going to have information, and I think we can help construct people helping us construct getting to yes.
And I'll just say that my view is that Lane County, under our county administrator, has really adopted a very proactive and business-like approach to a lot of things. And one of my good friends in this community is a retired marketing professor at the U of O. And one time I was in his office, and he had a whole bunch of packages, and they were all different colors, but it was the same design. And I said, what's all that stuff? He goes, we've been hired to do a marketing study to find out whether consumers, which package they like the best. And I said, well, how big of a project is he? We've got maybe 50 students working on this, and they're paying us, I don't know, $100,000 to test this out. And he says, when they want to sell something, they really want to know what customers really prefer, okay? So in my view, we have customers, and they are called voters. And in my view, we should be as responsive as possible to them. And we don't typically do what I'm suggesting. And I would say to Jay, you said, well, this might end up being a big construction project where we would hire all these people and they'd be paid these very high, in your view, wages. Maybe they'll have to pay prevailing wage, or maybe they'll be administered by employees that are covered by the PERS program. Well, what if the public said, we really like, the one idea we really like is the one where we have a revolving loan fund, and it's run by a consortium of credit unions or banks and credit unions in Lane County, and would involve not zero, but almost zero public employees. But it would be something that would be good for the community. Wouldn't it be then worth it to have polled and said, do you want to fund, people who won't work and who are resistant to any kind of counseling? You want to fund them, or do you want to fund a revolving loan fund? Well, maybe, I'll just speculate, they'd want to fund the revolving loan fund as being a good thing. But I think for now, and I know our chair, having recently had this job, has to keep us on schedule, I would say I'm all for putting this off until after the May election.
Any other comments? Commissioner Farr?
Well, Portland passed a $267 million bond, which was 42 cents, and it got a 62% yes. Now, that doesn't mean that we could do it here, because Portland's in a very different economic situation. But it was exactly what you were describing, what Joe went out for. They had a consortium of business people. In fact, the Portland Business Alliance, PBA, I think is what it's called, was one of the major drivers in researching and putting the bond forward. So research it, figure out what it is that people are willing to discuss even, and then move forward from that point. But back to the original thing, when I questioned why staff wasn't here, you answered it thoroughly and wisely. I think it was a wise discussion that we had today without staff, without burdening them with the presentation. This was just a discussion among the board. Worked out as such. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. And thanks for bringing up the Business Alliance, because I think the value that we have here with Better Housing Together is there is a huge consortium between business communities, nonprofits, governmental agencies, and if we're going to be able to move the discussion about housing, not only from a framework of what we need to do strategically, but to a question of funding, that is the body of people we want in the room and want to be able to collaborate with everybody and bring everybody on board. Otherwise, I feel it will be divided and fail.
Isn't it wonderful that Karen and Karen are both in the room here?
I didn't even know you were in the room.
Any other comments? Okay, thank you for a good discussion. We have already worked through item 15, which were announcements and future board assignment requests. But I'll just ask one more time if there are any additional.
Well, I think we should make it formal that we're going to set up another discussion on this topic in June after the May election and the report and the digestion of the report. So,
You know, okay. We'll add that. Follow up after the final report. All right. So we have a couple items left for today. We have review of assignments, we have an executive session, and we do need to bring something up under other business before our executive session. Do you want to go through review of assignments first?
Sure, I just had two Commissioner Buck's prior requests for a work session on settlement notifications. Is that right, a work session? Or an update from staff on the process?
I think a work session might be good because we need to know, we had lots of questions.
Okay, so work session on settlement negotiation, the process for settlement negotiations and notification of the board. And then Commissioner Sorensen's request to follow up on the discussion of affordable housing after the May election.
And I believe Commissioner Bozovich had an item on burial grounds,
Yeah, there's a future agenda item.
private burial ground. So we have three.
Access.
Access. Anything else?
Was that a work session? Was it
Yeah, I think that
Yeah.
was a work session.
Yeah, I assume so. Just to talk about it so we can decide whether we want to take a position and then ask for a legislative
that makes sense,
concept.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So we can get back to Senator Roblin and say, yeah, no,
Maybe.
maybe.
Okay, then I'm gonna go down to item 18, other business. Prior to reading us into our executive session, I got a call at lunchtime that on our consent calendar earlier in the day, staff intended to pull item D3, order 20-02-11-06, in the matter of authorizing a sale of the county-owned property for $90,000 pursuant to a land sale contract to Christopher and Dina Whirlpool. And unbeknownst to all of us, it was not pulled in time. And so we have been asked if we would rescind our consent calendar items, remove that particular item, and reapprove the consent
So do we
calendar.
need to move to reconsider that? And
It
then-
can be done either way.
Yeah,
I move to reconsider and not approve that board order.
Is there a
second.
Okay. Motion to reconsider by Commissioner Sorensen, second by Commissioner Bozovich. Any discussion? Was that a hand?
No.
Oh, okay. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. No nays, okay, motion
I
passes
move to amend the
unanimously.
consent calendar to pull item 63.
Second.
All right. We have a motion on the floor to reapprove our consent calendar
Yeah,
without 63.
The motion to approve is back on the table. I move to amend it to pull that item.
Okay.
Sorry.
Motion to amend and pull that item by Commissioner Bozovich, second by Commissioner Sorensen. Do we, is there an issue? Are we okay?
Right, communicate over.
Okay. Any discussion?
I can translate the discussion Steve had with Devin if you would like.
Please do.
All right. Let's move to a vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Motion passes unanimously.
Now we need to move,
Yes.
vote on the actual consent calendar less the item, because
Yes,
it's been amended.
correct. You want to make a motion?
The motion's on the table already.
What's that?
The motion's on the table, having been
Correct.
amended.
Oh.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm not a parliamentarian.
You got technical
Parliamentarian.
assistance here. We're good.
But I'm working on it.
I've served as well, so.
That
Gee,
helps.
what a surprise.
Okay, so the motion is back on the table without item 6D3. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. All right, motion passes unanimously. Consent calendar fixed.
All that was for Diana to.
All that was,
Right.
yes, we needed to do that for Diane.
Due to, we need to get the recorder and.
Yes,
Okay.
I was gonna read us in
Perfect,
first.
yeah. And then we've got everyone, we just need 2 minutes.
Okay, so we're gonna move to executive session, and I'm gonna read us in. So this is, we'll be moving into executive session for Tuesday, February 11th at 2020. The Board of County Commissioners will meet in executive session to conduct deliberations with persons designated by the governing body to negotiate real property transactions. This executive session is held pursuant to ORS 192.6602E, which allows the Board of Commissioners to meet in executive session for the purposes listed above. Representatives of the news media and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. All other members of the audience are asked to leave the room. Representatives of the news media are specifically directed not to report on any of the deliberations during the executive session, except to state the general subject of the session as previously announced. No decision may be made in executive session, and we reserve the right to come back out into public session should the need arise. I'm not currently seeing the need to arise. So, we have now recessed our regular session, and now